Anatomy Assignment 6 Joints. Fibrous joints is an immovable joint, which means it doesn't allow movement and its main function is to protect. An example of this is the cranium, because when you header a football, the cranium protects the brain and stops you from getting brain damage. Fibrous joints don't have any joint cavity and are joined by fibrous tissue. During infant years, the fibrous tissue is very wide apart, which allows the joint to be flexible and give a little movement. This is important for childbirth, and as the child gets older, the fibrous tissue gets closer, which causes it to be stronger and completely immovable for protection. Cartilaginous joints are slightly movable, and its main function is to act as a shock absorber. An example of this is the vertebrae. It contains lots of little vertebrae which make up one big movement, and this is the same. And an example of this is the vertebrae. It contains lots of little vertebrae that make up the vertebrae, and this is the same for the movement it allows. Lots of little movements in the vertebrae allow it to make one big movement. They are joined together by articular cartilage, which prevents friction between the joints, and they are separated by white fibrocartilage. This is a tough shock absorber that compresses for a slight movement in each of the 33 individual vertebrae. It also protects the spinal cord. Synovial joint has 6 different types of joints. These are the ball and socket, pivot, hinge, condynoid, gliding, and saddle joints. These contain a joint cavity and fluid which allows movement and prevents friction. They are held together by ligaments, which is why they are able to move in more than one direction. The end of the bones are covered in cartilage, which means that it's protected from friction and getting displaced if it was to be knocked, because the cartilage also acts as a shock absorber. They are freely movable joints. However, the different types of joints have specific structures which can prevent certain movements. There are 12 different types of movements that can be made at a joint. Flexion is when the angle at the joint decreases. An example of this would be the beginning of a bicep curl, so when you bring your forearm up towards the bicep. Extension is when the angle at the joint increases and could be seen as the opposite to flexion. An example of this is the downward stage of the bicep curl, when you return the forearm back to the side of your body. Adduction is when you move limbs towards the midline of your body. An example of this would be in breaststroke, when your arms are stretched above your head and you bring them back to the side of your body. Abduction is when you move your limbs away from the midline of the body. An example of this is the start of a star jump. It's when you bring your arms from the side of your body to above your head in a sideways circular motion. This is the opposite to adduction. Plantar flexion is when the angle at the foot increases, and an example of this would be when you jump upwards. This is because your toes point towards the floor and your toes are further away from your shin. Dorsiflexion is when the angle at the foot decreases. An example of this would be doing a squat. This is because your shin gets closer to your toes. It's also the opposite to plantar flexion. Pronation is when the palm of your hand faces downwards. An example of this is when you hold a basketball and start bouncing it to dribble. It's when you twist your forearm so that the palm is facing down, but the upper part of the arm stays in the same position throughout. Supination is when the palm of your hand faces upwards. An example of this is when you catch a cricket ball into your chest. This is the opposite to pronation, so the palm of your hand is facing downwards, and then as you catch the ball, you twist your forearm without moving the upper arm, so that your palms are facing up. Inversion is when the sole of the foot faces inwards. An example of this would be in football when curling the ball with the inside of your foot. This normally happens when taking a free kick during the game or in training, however, is a key skill to have as it can be done anywhere on the pitch. It's done by twisting the ankle as if you was trying to get your big toe to touch the other side of the ball when kicking it. Eversion is when the sole of the foot faces outwards. An example of this would be when doing a sidestep in rugby. So you would step left and then right. As you stepped left, the right foot would stay in a similar position, so would end up for a very short period of time standing on the inside of your foot, leaving the sole facing outwards. Circumduction is when the limb moves in a circular motion around a joint. An example of this would be a bowl in cricket. This is when the arm goes from front to back, up and down and forwards around the shoulder joint whilst keeping the arm straight. Rotation is the movement around an axis. An example of this would be checking your shoulder in football. This is because the neck is moving around the longitudinal axis, which on paper is a line that goes from the head to the feet, cutting through the belly button to make sure that it's the middle of the body. It's sometimes known as the midline. The head goes from facing forwards to almost facing backwards, and then back to the front the same way it got back. The diagram shows what makes up a synovial joint and is what is needed for a synovial joint. Label 1 on the diagram is the muscle, label 2 is the tendon, 3 is the articular cartilage, which is what's at the end of the bones to ensure that they don't grind against each other during movement. 4 is the synovial fluid, which is there to lubricate the joint. 5 is the joint capsule, which is what protects the joint and holds the bones in place. 6 is synovial membrane. This lines the joint to hold and protect the fluid inside. 7 are the ligaments. These attach bone to bone and hold them in place. And 8 is the bone. The ball and socket joint moves in all axes, meaning it can complete flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, rotation, and circumduction. They are held together by ligaments, which would be the only thing to stop movement. However, this means they can dislocate easily because there's not much holding the bones in place. It has a very smooth surface, so that is the ball of the joint can fit into the socket or cup of the joint and move around freely with no jolting or getting stiff. There are two ball and socket joints in the body. They are found at the shoulder and tip. An example of this would be a tennis player because they use their arms and shoulders a lot when swinging to hit the ball. When doing a serve, they use the full range of the ball and socket joint because the arm moves back, up and around to hit the ball at its highest point in the air. The hinge joint only allows movement in one plane. This means that for the elbow and knee it can only do the moves flexion and extension, and the ankle can only do plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. An example at the knee would be a footballer when kicking a volley, because the knee bends in flexion to get power behind the shot, and then extension occurs to contact the ball so it goes in the right direction. The end of one bone is a cylinder but cut in half so the top is open, so the end of the other bone can fit in and it effectively rocks side to side to make the joint do flexion and extension. The way the bones fit together means they hardly hardly ever dislocate or get injured at the joint. This is because it's quite secure. The limited movements at these joints means that it prevents the limbs from going in different directions. However, this isn't a massive problem, as during sport it doesn't hinder movements in a way it protects the body, especially in the knee, as it provides a stable base to stand on, and when doing press-ups, the arm provides the same. This is because they can't do abduction and adduction. They're almost locked in place, which means they won't collapse underneath you if you wasn't controlling the movement. So the body doesn't really need these joints to do other movements because the shoulder and hip allow similar movements to abduction, adduction, plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, and rotation. Pivot joint only allows rotation at the neck and the proximal radioulnar joint, which is just below the elbow and causes the ulna and radius to be able to effectively switch place by rotation to do the movement supination and pronation. An example of this would be at the neck, when a hockey player turns their head to check the shoulder before they get past the ball, to be able to see players behind them. This allows them to know whether to turn, pass the ball back, or take them on. The pivot joint has one cylindrical bone that fits into one ring-like bone to allow rotation, but also stop other movements because the bone can't bend. The cylindrical bone can only twist in the ring, and the ring stops the bone from moving side to side. However, because the neck is connected to the vertebrae, it allows the neck to be able to tilt sideways. Also, the vertebrae allows the neck to tilt forwards and backwards, which is effectively flexion and extension. This means the neck doesn't need to be able to do any more movements than rotation. Because it is connected to the vertebrae, the little bones allow big movements, so the neck looks like it can do more movements than it technically can. The conjonoid joint allows flexion, extension, adduction, abduction, and circumduction. An example of this is the wrist. It can move in many directions, and the ligaments help to prevent the wrist from dislocating. A table tennis player would use many different movements of the wrist when playing a game because they have many shots they can execute. For example, forehand, backhand, and spin shots need the wrist to be able to little flick movements to get power on their shot as well. The egg-shaped bones fit into an oval cavity of another bone. This provides a stable base when doing press-ups and using free weights. It can't do rotation, supination, and pronation. However, because the wrist is located at the end of the arm, there are two joints that come before it, the elbow and shoulder. These joints allow the wrist to move in very similar movements, so not being able to do these moves doesn't affect athletes' performance. Gliding joints allow inversion and eversion in the hand and foot, more specifically the metatarsals and metacarpals. They don't allow much movement, which could be because they are short, flat cuboid bones that join together and slide over each other. An example of this is the subtalar, and the bones glide over each other, allowing the foot to face inwards and outwards. When playing football, inversion and eversion of the foot allows the player to be able to curl the ball. The shape of the bones allows this little movement to happen whilst keeping a strong, stable structure. This is because the bones are cuboid and smooth, and the bones can glide along each other, however, not too far because the bones are only short. Also, because they are cuboid, it means that they are quite strong and won't break easily. If there was a different type of joint here, it would create more movement. However, this could take away from how stable the joint is, and wouldn't be a good base for the body to stand on or even run on, because you would have to control the ankle from twisting around. Saddle joints allows flexion